This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I want to talk about something really important today. We have entered a new world of crisis that very few people understand. One of the biggest things that we have to understand about the conflict-ridden world that we live in is that we have entered another nuclear age, an age where nuclear war, the use of a nuclear bomb, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for the first time, the use of a nuclear bomb might come true in our lifetime. That's the big thing that we need to worry about. For a brief illusory moment in human history, the bomb seemed to be fading. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a generation came of age, believing that nuclear weapons were actually quite grotesque, but they were also receding into the background. There weren't so much conversation about the actual use of nuclear weapons anymore. The world had seen the kind of devastation, the absolute mad devastation that nuclear weapons could do, and they were slowly being pushed into the background, especially after the end of the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War had seen a great competition, including building nuclear arsenal between the US and Soviet Union, but after the end of the Cold War, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a real sense that this fundamental fear of mutually assured destruction was slowly beginning to end, and that was a matter of great hope. And therefore a whole new generation came of age, believing that the existential dread that haunted their parents, the drills, the shelters, the cinematic apocalypse, they were all replaced by cautious optimism. Arms control treaties were signed, stockpiles were reduced, and the prevailing wisdom held that the use of such weapons, nuclear weapons, was not just strategically unsound, but morally unthinkable. It was absolutely unthinkable. Global concerns pivoted to asymmetric warfare, terrorism, economic integration, history. For instance, Francis Fukuyama, the thinker, declared had ended. The world had moved on. It was moving towards liberal democracy, and the shadow of nuclear weapons was beginning to genuinely recede. All that has been devastated. All that has been changed. Today there's a whole new world where the use of nuclear weapons seems more imminent than ever before. Well, that era of hope has ended very tragically, very sadly. Today, that holiday from history is definitely over. The unthinkable is once again being taught, and the language of nuclear brinkmanship, long relegated to history books, has roared back into the lexicon of international affairs. A confluence of geopolitical earthquakes, most notably the brutal conventional war in Ukraine and the simmering shadow war over Iran's nuclear ambitions, has shattered the post-Cold War consensus. Compounded by the meteoric rise of China's nuclear arsenal, some say China is adding 100 nuclear warheads every single year, one of the most dramatic rise of nuclear arsenal in human history. All of that has brought about the crumbling of the arms control architecture that once provided a fragile safety net. The world has stumbled into a second nuclear age. This new era is not a simple reboot of the Cold War's bipolar standoff. It is more complex, more multipolar, and dangerously, absolutely unpredictable environment where the incentives for proliferation are multiplying and the old nuclear taboo is disappearing. It is perilously eroding, and more there is nuclear brinkmanship. Let's talk a little bit about Ukraine and what happened there. No single event has ever done more to resurrect the specter of nuclear conflict than Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Remember, Ukraine had willingly at one point given up its nuclear weapons. And that choice today, no doubt the Ukrainians are rethinking that choice. They've given up nuclear weapons, and now, of course, this brutal war continues where Russia continuously threatens the use of nuclear weapons. The war is not only a human and geopolitical catastrophe, but also a devastatingly clear lesson in the brutal logic of nuclear deterrence. To understand its impact, one must look back to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum.
The presidents of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the United States of America, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will now sign the Memorandum on Security Assurances for Ukraine.
In this landmark agreement, a newly independent Ukraine voluntarily relinquished the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, weapons left on its territory after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in exchange for security assurances from the United States, the United Kingdom, and most faithfully, the Russian Federation. These assurances guaranteed respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and existing borders. Russia's invasion not only violated that agreement, it absolutely destroyed it. For nations around the world, the lesson was stark and chilling. Ukraine's great mistake, perhaps, was giving up its bombs. The memorandum proved to be a worthless piece of paper when confronted with territorial ambitions of a nuclear-armed aggressor, and also the nuclear-armed aggressor, Russia in this case, complaining that NATO was moving its armaments, its arsenal, closer and closer to its border. That was the conflict, but it absolutely cannot be avoided that had Ukraine had nuclear weapons at this point in time, the war would have seemed very different. The implicit message sent by Moscow to the rest of the world was that nuclear weapons are not merely a deterrent of last resort, but the ultimate license for conventional warfare, providing a shield under which a state can pursue its objectives without fear of direct intervention from other major powers. Throughout the conflict, the Kremlin has engaged in a calculated campaign of nuclear coercion. President Vladimir Putin and his senior officials have repeatedly issued veiled and overt threats, reminding the West of Russia's vast nuclear arsenal to deter NATO from establishing a no-fly zone or putting boots on the ground. They have spoken of putting nuclear forces on high alert, deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, and framed the conflict as an existential struggle in which by all means everything that Russia had would be brought on the table. This rhetoric has had a profound impact. It has successfully limited the scope of Western military aid and prevented direct confrontation, demonstrating the immense coercive power of nuclear arsenal in modern warfare. For aspiring nuclear states or those wavering on the brink, the implications are absolutely stark and profound. Why would any nation in a hostile neighborhood now trust in security guarantees from great powers? The Ukrainian experience suggests that such promises are conditional and unreliable. The only true guarantee of sovereignty, the argument now goes, is domestic nuclear deterrent. The logic is undoubtedly resonating in capitals around the world, from Taipei to Tehran, from Seoul to Riyadh. Let's talk a little bit about Iran now. Well, if Ukraine represents a sudden shock, the Iranian nuclear crisis has been a slow-moving proliferation disaster, escalating now for decades. For years, Iran has pursued a nuclear program that it insists is for peaceful energy purposes, but which the West and its regional rivals fear is a cover for developing weapons. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, was a landmark diplomatic achievement designed to put a lid to this ambition. It traded sanctions relief for verifiable limits on Iran's nuclear activities, pushing the breakout time, the time needed to produce enough fissile material for one bomb, to over 1 year. The US withdrawal under Donald Trump from the JCPOA in 2018 and the subsequent maximum pressure campaign of sanctions, however, led Iran to systematically breach the deal's constraints.
In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Today, Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity, only a stone's throw from the roughly 90% purity level needed for a nuclear bomb. It possesses a stockpile of highly enriched material sufficient for several bombs if the decision were made to pursue them. While US intelligence assesses that Tehran has not yet made that final decision, Iran has become de facto a nuclear threshold state. It has mastered the fuel cycle and can no longer be untaught, quote unquote, this knowledge. Very, very, very dangerous indeed for the world. The danger of an Iranian bomb lies not only in the weapon itself, but in the almost certain proliferation cascade it would trigger across the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Iran's chief regional and sectarian rival, has explicitly stated that it will pursue nuclear weapons if Iran obtains them. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been unequivocal. If Iran developed a nuclear bomb, he has said, we will follow suit as soon as possible. This is not a bluff. The kingdom has financial resources to purchase the technology and expertise, especially from Pakistani or other sources. A nuclear-armed Iran and a nuclear-armed Saudi Arabia would create a terrifyingly unstable regional dynamic. Other powers such as Turkey and Egypt, with their own regional aspirations and ambitions and historical rivalries, would face immense pressure to immediately acquire nuclear weapons themselves. A Middle East with 3 or 4 competing nuclear powers, imagine what that would be, entangled in a web of proxy wars and ancient animosities. This would be a nightmare scenario, making the Cuban Missile Crisis look like a joke, a model of stable, rational crisis management. The war in Iran, therefore, is not just a potential direct conflict with the rest of the world, but a slow-burning fuse that threatens to ignite a regional arms race of catastrophic proportions. And of course, we cannot not talk about what's going on in China. The dragon's arsenal. For decades, China maintained a posture of minimum deterrence. It possessed a small but credible arsenal sufficient to survive a first strike and retaliate, thereby deterring an attack. This doctrine was designed to be non-threatening and to allow Beijing to focus on its economic development. That era, ladies and gentlemen, is absolutely over. The dragon now wishes to dominate the world, and one of the key pivotal pillars of this dominance is nuclear dominance. It is growing its nuclear arsenal by all reports, as all reports suggest, at a frightening pace. More than 100 nuclear warheads, some reports suggest, every single year. No country has developed this kind of pace in developing nuclear weapons after the Cold War, and China's pace terrifies the world. In recent years, satellite imagery and intelligence reports have revealed a stunning and rapid expansion of China's nuclear forces, a move that Pentagon officials have described as a strategic breakout. The evidence is undeniable and unmistakable. Commercial satellites have identified at least 3 massive new missile fields in western China, containing over 300 silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles or ICBMs. This is in addition to the rapid development and deployment of new road mobile ICBMs, advanced submarine-launched ballistic missiles or SLBMs, from its growing fleet of nuclear submarines and hypersonic glide vehicles, maneuverable weapons that fly at extreme speeds and are designed to evade existing missile defenses. Any air defense that other countries are creating, China wants to ensure that it has weapons to break through, evade them, and attack if necessary with nuclear weapons. The US Department of Defense projects that China could have as many as 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, bringing it to a level of rough parity with the developed strategic forces of both the United States and Russia. The rationale behind this build-up is multifaceted. First, Beijing seeks to establish itself as a true peer competitor to the United States, believing that a superpower requires a supersized arsenal. Second, and more urgently, it is building a force designed to deter American intervention in a potential conflict over Taiwan. A massive and survivable nuclear force raises the stakes of any US military involvement to an unacceptable level. Third, it complicates the strategic calculus of both Washington and Moscow, shattering the bipolar nuclear world and creating a more unstable 3-body problem. This shift fundamentally alters the global strategic landscape. Arms control, already on life support, becomes exponentially more difficult. Bilateral treaties like the New START between the US and Russia are insufficient when a third, unconstrained major nuclear power is rapidly expanding its forces. China has so far refused to engage in trilateral arms control talks, arguing its arsenal is still smaller and purely defensive. This refusal, however, creates a dangerous security dilemma as its build-up fuels anxiety and potential counter-moves in both Washington and Moscow, as well as in regional powers like India. So the old nuclear order is crumbling, quite like the global order. A new order is emerging which is far more unstable. The crisis in Ukraine and Iran, along with China's rise, are occurring against the backdrop of systematic dismantling of the global arms control regime. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty is dead. The Open Skies Treaty has been abandoned by its key signatories. The future of the New START, the last remaining pillar of US-Russian arms control, is deeply uncertain. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, the cornerstone of global effort to halt the spread of nuclear weapons, is under immense strain, seen by many non-nuclear states as a fundamentally unfair bargain in a world where nuclear powers are re-emphasizing, not diminishing, the role of their arsenals. This erosion of norms and treaties is emboldening existing nuclear states and tempting new ones. North Korea, a de facto nuclear power for years, continues to test more and more advanced missiles with the goal of developing reliable capability to strike the United States mainland. The long-standing nuclear standoff between India and Pakistan remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. Beyond these established players, the Ukrainian lesson is forcing uncomfortable conversations in countries that have long sheltered under the US nuclear umbrella. In South Korea and in Japan, public and political debate about developing an indigenous nuclear capability, once an absolutely taboo and fringe topic, have re-entered the mainstream. Faced with an increasingly aggressive North Korea and an expansionist China, faith in American security guarantees, while still official policy, is no longer absolute. The world has turned a dark corner. The brief, hopeful interlude that followed the Cold War has given way to a new, more perilous nuclear age defined by multipolar competition, coercive brinkmanship, and collapsing norms. The idea that nuclear weapons were becoming unimportant has proven to be tragically false. They have roared back to the center of global affairs, not just as dusty relics, but as the perceived ultimate arbiters of national survival and geopolitical ambition. Reversing the slide towards catastrophe requires monumental effort of statecraft and recognition of our shared peril. It demands a revival of diplomacy, the creative pursuit of new arms control frameworks suited for a multipolar world, and a concentrated global effort to de-escalate tensions and rebuild the shattered nuclear taboo against nuclear use. The bomb is back. The fear is real. The challenge of our time is to ensure that the unthinkable does not once again become the inevitable.